The sound came without warning. A single violent crack of metal against metal split the quiet of an empty intersection. A patrol car had driven straight into the rear of a black SUV, deliberately, without hesitation. The impact was hard enough to rattle windows 2 blocks away. The officer stepped out slowly, adjusting his sunglasses. A grin was already forming on his face, the kind worn by a man who believed he was about to teach someone a lesson she would never forget. Inside the SUV, a woman sat completely still, her hands resting on the wheel, her expression unreadable. She did not shout. She did not reach for her phone in panic. She simply set it down on the passenger seat, looked into her mirror, and issued a quiet command that would change everything in the moments that followed. Activate Protocol Sentinel. Within moments, a low mechanical rumble began to build somewhere beyond the horizon. At first, it was only a faint vibration. Then it became unmistakable, the sound of heavy engines converging from every direction at once. By the time the dust settled, 11 armored vehicles had surrounded the intersection, and every one of them had stopped for her. Her name was Dr. Simone Whitaker, and to anyone who glanced at her, she looked like nothing more than a tired professional driving home after an exhausting stretch of work. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back neatly. The only visible possession of value was a slim leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside her phone. What no one could see were the years she had spent building a career that very few people were ever allowed to know about. She had once commanded a federal tactical unit responsible for neutralizing domestic terror threats before they ever reached the public. It was a job that demanded absolute composure under conditions most people would never survive with their minds intact. Now she served as the chief executive of a private security firm contracted directly by the federal government to protect the nation's most critical infrastructure, the power grids, water systems, and unseen arteries that kept entire cities alive. She rarely spoke of any of it. She rarely needed to. Everything had begun as ordinarily as ever. She had sat through a long series of briefings about vulnerabilities in regional energy substations, the kind of meeting that involved maps most citizens would never see, and threat assessments they would never hear about. When it ended, she thanked her colleagues, gathered her folder, and walked to her car alone, the same way she always did. There was no security detail trailing behind her, no black convoy of escort vehicles, no visible sign that she was anyone other than a woman heading home. She preferred it that way. Power, she had learned, was never something worth advertising. The less attention she drew to herself, the more effectively she could do the work that mattered most. She drove with the windows cracked, the cool air slipping through the gap, gray clouds hanging low over the city skyline. The streets were quiet, caught in a lull between the busiest waves of traffic. She used the silence as she always did, to think, to plan, and to let her mind settle after the strain of the briefing. She had no reason to expect that anything about this drive would be different from 1,000 others before it. She checked her mirrors out of habit rather than concern, adjusted the radio to a low murmur of news, and continued forward through streets she had driven 100 times without incident. Colleagues who worked with her daily rarely spoke of her past in any detail, partly because she discouraged it, and partly because most of them simply did not know the full extent of what she had once done for a living. To the analysts and engineers who filled the floors of her firm's downtown office, she was simply the director, a woman who asked precise questions, who never raised her voice in a meeting, and who somehow always seemed to anticipate a threat 3 steps before anyone else in the room noticed it forming. She kept her personal life quiet, her home unremarkable, her routines deliberately ordinary, because she understood better than almost anyone what happened when a person of her position became too visible, too easy to track, too predictable to those who might wish her harm. Her routine followed the same disciplined pattern: a run, a review of overnight security reports over black coffee, and a commute she insisted on handling herself rather than delegating to a driver. It was not stubbornness that kept her behind the wheel. It was a philosophy she had carried since her earliest years in federal service, the belief that comfort bred carelessness, and that a person responsible for protecting others could never afford to lose touch with the ordinary rhythms of the world she was sworn to defend. That philosophy had served her well, and nothing about the quiet drive suggested it was about to be tested in a way she had never anticipated. A few blocks behind her, a patrol car idled at a red light. Its driver watched her SUV pass with an interest that had nothing to do with any actual violation. Officer Wade Callahan was restless by nature, the kind of man who measured his own authority by how quickly other people folded in front of it. He had built a private reputation, quiet, but well known among certain colleagues, for testing people he decided did not belong, and for inventing small reasons to stop drivers he found suspicious for reasons he could never fully explain. He saw the SUV, expensive, dark, driven by a black woman alone, and something in him decided immediately that this was worth following. He pulled out behind her without activating his lights, trailing at a careful distance, waiting for any excuse at all. The excuse, when it came, was almost laughably small. She had drifted slightly over a faded lane marking while checking her blind spot, a movement so minor that most officers would never have noticed it, much less acted on it. Wade switched on his lights immediately, satisfaction settling into his chest as he watched her SUV signal calmly and pull to the curb without hesitation. He approached the vehicle slowly, one hand resting near his belt, his posture deliberately exaggerated, the walk of a man performing authority. He tapped twice on her window, and when she lowered it, he offered no greeting. He asked flatly for her to step out of the vehicle. Simone studied him for a moment, taking in his stance, the tightness in his jaw, and the way his eyes moved over her car with something closer to hostility than suspicion. She did not argue. She unbuckled her seatbelt, opened her door slowly and deliberately, and stepped onto the pavement with her hands visible the entire time. She kept her voice level as she asked what the issue was. Wade responded with a vague reference to a lane violation, but his tone carried an edge that suggested the real issue had very little to do with the road. She nodded once, calm, and asked whether he needed her license and registration, already reaching slowly toward the folder on her seat. Her compliance seemed to unsettle him more than resistance would have. He had expected frustration, perhaps a raised voice, something he could use to justify escalating further. But instead, he found himself facing a woman who answered every question evenly, who moved without sudden gestures, who watched him with an unreadable patience that made him feel, for reasons he could not name, smaller rather than larger. He circled her vehicle twice, running his hand along the frame, peering through the tinted rear windows as though searching for something incriminating. He found nothing. Her paperwork was flawless, her tone remained polite, yet something in him still refused to let the encounter end. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with the traffic stop at all. He demanded to know where she worked, why she was driving alone, and whose car it really was. Every question came with a faint sneer, as though he had already decided that any answer she gave would be a lie. Simone answered simply that the vehicle was hers, and that she was returning home from a work meeting, offering no further detail, no justification, no defensiveness. Her refusal to perform discomfort for him seemed to agitate him further. He stepped closer, raised his voice, and told her that people like her needed to learn to respect an officer's authority. The words hung in the quiet street long after he had spoken them. He asked to search her vehicle, a request with no legal grounding given the nature of the stop, and Simone declined politely, informing him that he was welcome to call for a supervisor if he believed there was cause. The suggestion seemed to insult him further, as though the mere idea that she understood her rights well enough to decline calmly was itself a form of defiance he could not tolerate. He leaned toward her open window close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and asked whether she understood who she was speaking to. She met his eyes without flinching and told him she understood exactly who she was speaking to, an officer conducting a routine stop that had already exceeded its reasonable scope. The answer was too composed for him to argue with directly, and that composure seemed to bother him more than any argument could have. A delivery driver parked nearby paused to watch the exchange, sensing that something was building which did not belong in an ordinary traffic stop. Wade noticed him and straightened abruptly, recalibrating his approach now that an audience had formed. He softened his tone for a moment, just enough to sound reasonable to anyone listening from a distance, before returning his attention fully to Simone with the same simmering hostility that had never actually left him. He informed her that he would be writing her a citation for the lane violation, regardless of how cooperative she had been, a decision that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with his need to feel that the encounter had ended on his terms rather than hers. A few pedestrians on the opposite sidewalk had slowed their pace, sensing the tension without yet understanding its shape. Simone remained still, her expression calm, her eyes steady on his. She told him evenly that she had complied with every request and asked whether she was free to go. It was a simple question, entirely reasonable, and it seemed to be the final provocation Wade needed. His jaw tightened, his hand flexed at his side, and for a brief moment, something behind his eyes shifted from irritation into something closer to rage. The particular rage of a man who has just realized he cannot make someone afraid of him no matter how hard he tries. He told her sharply to get back in her vehicle, his voice carrying now loud enough that the pedestrians across the street paused entirely to watch. Simone returned to her seat without argument, closing the door gently, reaching for her seatbelt as though the encounter had simply concluded the way countless mundane stops before it had. She checked her mirror, signaled, and began to pull slowly away from the curb, following every instruction she had been given. It was in that exact moment, as her SUV eased forward, that Wade made the decision that would unravel everything he had ever built. He returned to his patrol car, slid into the driver's seat, and without any warning at all, without any radio call, without any justification he would later be able to articulate, he slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The patrol car surged forward and struck the rear of her SUV with enough force to send a violent jolt through the frame. Metal crumpled, glass fractured along the edge of her taillight. The collision echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. For a moment, everything went still. Simone's hands tightened briefly on the wheel, her body absorbing the shock of the impact. But her expression did not break into panic. She remained still, breathing evenly and assessing rather than reacting. It was the same instinct that had carried her through situations far more dangerous than this one. She checked her mirrors, confirmed she was uninjured, and only then did she turn her attention to the man now stepping out of his patrol car behind her. His expression was already twisting into something defensive, as though he were rehearsing the story he intended to tell. Wade approached her window with none of the confidence he had carried moments earlier. His voice was fast, clipped, blaming her instantly for the collision, insisting she had reversed unexpectedly, insisting she had caused the impact herself through some sudden and reckless movement. It was a lie so immediate and so poorly constructed that even the pedestrians watching from across the street exchanged uncertain glances. Simone lowered her window fully and looked at him without raising her voice, without matching the panic he seemed to want her to display. She told him simply that she had been moving forward exactly as instructed and that the impact had come entirely from behind. Her calm seemed to enrage him further. He warned her that if she continued arguing, he would place her under arrest for obstruction, a threat that carried no legal weight, but was clearly meant to frighten her into silence. More pedestrians gathered along the sidewalk, several lifting their phones to capture the scene from multiple angles. The crumpled bumper, the officer's raised voice, and the woman sitting motionless and composed behind the wheel of a vehicle that had just been rammed without cause. Simone noticed the phones. She said nothing about them. Her focus remained entirely on the man in front of her, watching him the way she might once have watched a hostile actor during an operation, cataloging every word, every gesture, every inconsistency in his story. One bystander, an older man walking his dog, called out that he had seen the entire thing and that the officer had clearly struck the SUV without provocation. Wade spun toward him, ordering him to step back and mind his own business, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of a situation that was no longer following any script he recognized. The man did not retreat. He simply lowered his phone slightly, made sure the recording continued, and told Wade evenly that he intended to make sure the footage reached the right people. A second witness, a young woman on her way home from work, echoed the same account, describing the impact as sudden, deliberate, and entirely unprompted by anything the SUV had done. Wade's composure, already thin, began to fracture visibly under the weight of so many eyes. He paced beside his damaged cruiser, radio in hand, and changed his story each time he repeated it, first blaming a sudden reverse movement, then claiming his brakes had failed, and finally retreating into vague accusations about her attitude during the stop. None of the explanations aligned with what the growing crowd had witnessed with their own eyes, and the inconsistency itself became its own kind of evidence, visible to everyone, present long before any official investigation would ever confirm it. Simone reached for her phone without haste and dialed a number she had memorized long ago, but had never needed to use in the field. When the call connected, she did not raise her voice. She did not explain the situation, did not describe the collision, did not offer any context at all. She spoke 6 words evenly and without emotion, then ended the call before the line could fully open. Protocol Sentinel, red level, nothing more. Wade watched her, his confusion visible beneath the anger, still tightening his features. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and told her that pretending to have important connections would not save her from the consequences of what he was certain she had done. He assumed she was bluffing, just as he assumed most people did when they felt powerless before a badge. He continued speaking as though nothing had changed, listing threats and charges while his voice rose with every sentence, as if volume alone could restore the authority he felt slipping away. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that the moment her call connected, a chain of events had already begun moving far beyond his control. On the other end of that line, inside a secured command facility miles away, an operator had received a 2-word alert that triggered an immediate verification protocol reserved for a very small number of individuals nationwide. Simone's identity was confirmed almost immediately against a federal registry rarely accessed outside of extreme circumstances. Her vehicle, unbeknownst to Wade, carried encrypted equipment tied directly to national infrastructure protection, equipment that fell under strict federal jurisdiction the instant it was deliberately damaged. Almost immediately, alerts began populating across multiple secured channels simultaneously. Inside that command facility, the duty officer who received the alert did not hesitate to escalate it, understanding immediately what the designation meant without needing further explanation. A supervisor was notified almost immediately, and from there, the alert moved upward through the chain with a speed designed for exactly this kind of emergency. Every recipient had been trained to treat the words Protocol Sentinel as an instruction, not a suggestion. Cross-referencing systems confirm not only Simone's identity, but also her exact location through the vehicle's embedded tracking beacon. Installed quietly in every vehicle assigned to personnel at her clearance level, the beacon was invisible to anyone unaware of its existence and activated automatically when a distress signal of that classification was received. Separate from the local police response, Wade had triggered through his own radio call. An entirely independent federal channel had opened, one with no awareness of and no interest in whatever story he intended to tell his supervisors. The two systems, local and federal, were converging on the same intersection from completely different directions, moving at completely different speeds, and only one of them understood the true scale of what was actually unfolding on that ordinary street. At a nearby staging facility, tactical teams standing by for an unrelated exercise received the alert and redirected instantly. Engines roared to life, and drivers pulled onto access roads before their commanding officer had even finished briefing them. Overhead, a helicopter already airborne for routine patrol banked sharply and adjusted course toward the coordinates now flashing on its navigation display. None of the officers receiving these alerts needed further explanation. The words Protocol Sentinel carried weight on their own. Anyone cleared to hear them understood the designation immediately. A protected federal asset had come under direct physical threat. Back at the intersection, Wade remained entirely unaware, still pacing beside his damaged patrol car, still muttering into his radio about a woman who refused to cooperate. He had requested backup for what he described as a hostile and uncooperative driver, expecting perhaps one additional unit to arrive and reinforce his version of events. He had no reason to expect anything more. He glanced periodically at Simone, who remained seated calmly in her vehicle, her hands folded, her eyes fixed somewhere past him, watching the horizon the way a person watches for weather they already know is coming. The first sound arrived faintly, a low mechanical hum that most people would have mistaken for distant construction. Wade did not notice it at first, too absorbed in his own frustration, too certain that the situation remained entirely within his control. But the hum grew steadily louder, resolving slowly into the unmistakable rhythm of heavy engines, multiple engines, approaching from several directions at once. The pedestrians on the sidewalk fell silent, phones still raised, their attention shifting from the crumpled bumper to the horizon where dark shapes had begun to emerge. Soon, the quiet street transformed entirely. Armored vehicles rounded corners from 4 separate directions, their engines deep and deliberate, their tires gripping the pavement with a weight that seemed to press the entire block into stillness. Above them, a helicopter descended low enough to stir loose papers along the sidewalk, its rotors cutting through the gray air with a violence that made several bystanders instinctively step backward. Wade turned toward the sound, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion into something closer to disbelief, watching as vehicle after vehicle rolled to a stop around the intersection until 11 of them formed a wide, deliberate perimeter with Simone's damaged SUV at its center. The bystanders who had gathered earlier now stood frozen at the edges of the scene, phones still raised, but their expressions shifting from curiosity into something closer to awe. Traffic on the surrounding blocks had already been redirected by officers stationed at each entrance. Orange cones and flashing barricades appeared with a speed that suggested this response had been rehearsed many times, even if it had rarely been needed for a situation quite like this one. The dog walker, who had spoken up earlier, lowered his phone slightly and stared at the wall of armored vehicles surrounding the woman he had defended. He clearly struggled to reconcile the scale of what he was witnessing with the ordinary traffic stop that had begun at all. Wade's two colleagues, who had arrived in response to his initial request for backup, stood near their patrol car with a stillness that betrayed their confusion. Neither of them had received any information beyond a vague report of an uncooperative driver, and neither of them had any framework for understanding why a fleet of federal tactical vehicles was now converging on a fender bender. One of them turned toward Wade and asked quietly what exactly he had gotten them into, a question Wade had no answer for, his mouth opening and closing without sound as the reality of the situation settled over him with crushing weight. Doors opened in near unison, tactical personnel stepping out with a discipline that made clear this was no ordinary response. Wade instinctively reached for his radio, then let his hand fall, uncertain what exactly he was supposed to say. His earlier confidence had drained entirely from his posture, replaced by the rigid stillness of a man realizing far too late that he had catastrophically misjudged the moment. What had looked like a routine dispute only moments before now resembled a full federal operation, cordoned off, guarded, and utterly beyond his authority. From the center vehicle stepped a tall, middle-aged man. His uniform carried no rank insignia visible to civilians, yet his authority was unmistakable in the way every officer around him deferred instantly to his presence. His name was Commander Adrian Beckett, and he moved through the scene without hesitation, without glancing once at Wade, his attention fixed entirely on the woman, still seated calmly behind the wheel of her SUV. He crossed the pavement in long, unhurried strides, stopped beside her door, and lowered himself slightly to meet her eyes through the open window. "Are you injured, ma'am?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the imposing scale of the operation unfolding around them. Simone shook her head once, calm as ever, and told him she was fine, that the damage was to the vehicle rather than to herself. Beckett studied her for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly, the recognition of two people who had once shared far more dangerous circumstances than this one. He straightened, turned toward the gathered officers and personnel, now filling the intersection, and addressed them without raising his voice, his authority requiring no volume at all. He informed the assembled crowd in clear and measured words exactly who they were standing in the presence of. Dr. Simone Whitaker, he explained, served as the director of a federally contracted program responsible for the protection of the nation's most critical infrastructure systems. The vehicle behind her, the one that had just been deliberately struck, carried secured equipment classified under federal jurisdiction. Damage to that equipment constituted far more than a simple traffic incident. Any act of aggression against her person or her vehicle, he continued, fell under statutes reserved for threats against protected federal assets. Those statutes carried consequences far beyond anything normally associated with a local traffic stop. Wade stood frozen as the words settled over him, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he had dismissed only moments before with the figure now being described in front of dozens of witnesses. He opened his mouth, some fragment of explanation forming, but no sound emerged around him. The other officers who had arrived earlier in response to his initial call exchanged uncertain glances of their own, none of them having known any more than he had. Every one of them was now recalculating everything they thought they understood about the woman sitting quietly in the damaged SUV. Beckett continued, his tone measured but unyielding, explaining that the equipment inside her vehicle formed part of a broader encrypted communication network used to coordinate responses across several regional power grids, a network whose integrity depended entirely on the physical security of vehicles exactly like hers. Damage of the kind Wade had inflicted was not simply property destruction in the ordinary sense. Under statutes governing critical infrastructure protection, he explained, such damage was treated as a direct act against national security infrastructure, regardless of whether the person responsible understood the significance of what he was striking. Ignorance of her role, Beckett added quietly, did not change the legal weight of what had occurred, only the motive behind it. And the motive here appeared to have nothing to do with infrastructure at all. The words landed heavily on everyone present. Several of the newly arrived tactical personnel began methodically photographing the damage to Simone's vehicle, documenting the exact points of impact, the depth of the collision, the debris field scattered across the pavement. Others moved to secure the perimeter more tightly, ensuring no further contamination of the scene before the formal collection of evidence could begin. Wade watched all of it unfold around him with the dazed expression of a man who had walked into an ordinary day and somehow, through his own actions alone, transformed it into the defining catastrophe of his career. Beckett turned his attention next to the growing crowd of bystanders, many of whom still held their phones raised, capturing every second of the unfolding scene. He did not ask them to stop. He did not attempt to control the narrative or shield the moment from public view. Instead, he requested calmly that anyone with footage of the incident preserve it, explaining that any recorded evidence would be essential to the investigation that was about to begin. Several onlookers nodded, some visibly stunned by how quickly the situation had transformed from an ordinary dispute into something resembling a federal response. Soon afterward, investigators arrived to begin the methodical work of reconstructing exactly what had happened. They reviewed footage from a traffic camera mounted at the intersection. Its angle captured the entire sequence in unambiguous detail. The SUV pulling away exactly as instructed and the patrol car accelerating suddenly before striking it from behind with clear, deliberate force. They reviewed the dashboard camera from Wade's own vehicle, its recording confirming the same sequence with a precision that left no room for alternate interpretation. They collected footage from at least 6 separate bystanders, each clip corroborating the others, each one stripping away any possibility that Wade's version of events might survive scrutiny. Wade attempted weakly to offer an explanation, insisting the collision had been accidental, that his foot had slipped, that the vehicle in front of him had made an unexpected movement he could not have anticipated. No one around him appeared to believe a word of it. The footage told a story too consistent, too deliberate, too thoroughly documented from too many independent angles for any explanation involving accident or misunderstanding to hold together. Beckett listened to the excuse without interruption, his expression unreadable, and when Wade finished speaking, he said nothing in response at all. The silence itself carried more weight than any rebuke could have. Investigators cross-referenced the timestamps across every piece of footage collected, building a second-by-second timeline that left no gap for interpretation. The traffic camera showed Simone's vehicle signaling and merging smoothly, well within the flow of traffic. At that exact moment, Wade's patrol car accelerated from a full stop behind her. His own dashboard camera, which he had likely forgotten was even recording, captured his foot pressing the accelerator with clear and unmistakable force, rather than any sudden panicked motion consistent with an accident. The bystander clips gathered from 4 separate phones at 4 separate angles all showed the same sequence with no meaningful variation. Investigators later noted that such consistency was rare, even in far simpler cases. A forensic technician examined the physical damage to both vehicles as well, confirming that the pattern of impact was consistent with a direct accelerating collision rather than a low-speed drift or an accidental roll. The findings were rapidly compiled into a preliminary report, reflecting both the severity of the alleged offense and the unusual volume of corroborating evidence available from the beginning. Beckett reviewed the report personally before authorizing the next step, determined to ensure that every conclusion rested on documented fact rather than assumption, a standard he applied to every case under his command, regardless of who was involved. The order came swiftly and without ceremony. Beckett instructed the officers present to collect Wade's badge and weapon on the spot and formally suspend him pending a full investigation. The process unfolded before the same crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation. Wade stood motionless as his badge was removed from his belt, his weapon secured by another officer, the physical symbols of an authority he had spent years abusing, now taken from him in the middle of an ordinary street in full view of dozens of witnesses. As the investigation unfolded, Beckett found a quiet moment to speak privately with several of the officers who had known Simone only by reputation, sharing details that most of them had never heard before. During an earlier assault on a secured federal facility, Simone had been the ranking officer present when the situation collapsed into chaos. Communications were severed, exits were compromised, and dozens of federal employees were trapped inside a building under direct threat. She had organized an evacuation under conditions that should have made survival for everyone involved statistically unlikely. She moved through the building floor by floor, coordinating extraction routes with a composure that those who witnessed it still described with something close to reverence. When the situation was finally resolved, every employee inside the building had made it out alive, a result senior officials considered nearly miraculous given the scale of the threat. She was offered the nation's highest civilian commendation for the operation, a formal ceremony, public recognition, the kind of honor most people in her field spent entire careers hoping to receive. She declined it. She asked instead that the recognition be quietly redirected toward funding for the families of 2 colleagues who had not made it out of the building. She later stepped away from active federal service entirely. Beckett had been there during the assault, one of the officers she guided out through a service corridor most people did not even know existed. And he still remembered with total clarity the sound of her voice over a failing radio channel, calmly directing dozens of frightened people toward safety while explosions echoed somewhere behind her. He remembered how she had refused to leave until every person was accounted for, rejecting every order to evacuate until her own count matched the official roster twice. It was a detail he had never forgotten, and one he now shared with officers who had known her only as an unfamiliar face behind the wheel of a damaged SUV. He explained that in the years since leaving federal service, she had built her firm from nothing, recruiting former operators and engineers who shared her belief that the systems ordinary people relied on every single day deserved the same rigorous protection once reserved for military installations. Under her leadership, the firm had quietly prevented several attempted intrusions into regional power systems that never made the news. They were incidents the public would likely never understand in full, precisely because her methods emphasized prevention over publicity. It was, Beckett said, a philosophy that defined how she operated not only in her professional life, but also in the most personally threatening moments, as everyone at the intersection had now witnessed firsthand. She had not retreated from the work. She simply chose to continue it in a different form, building a private firm dedicated to protecting the exact kind of critical infrastructure that had nearly been destroyed during the assault. Her mission now encompassed power systems, water treatment facilities, communication networks, and the invisible foundations on which ordinary life depended without most people ever realizing it. It was this history, this record of sacrifice carried quietly rather than announced, that explained without any ambiguity why the federal response to her damaged vehicle had arrived with such overwhelming speed and scale. She was not simply an executive. She was in every meaningful sense someone the government had a direct and enduring obligation to protect. As word of the incident spread through official channels, a formal criminal investigation into Wade's conduct was opened immediately, moving with a speed that surprised even seasoned observers of similar cases in the past. Footage of the collision obtained through public records requests filed almost immediately by local reporters began circulating widely across news outlets, each replay making the deliberate nature of the impact unmistakable to anyone who watched it. City officials, facing mounting pressure from a public outraged by what they had seen, announced an independent review of the police department's traffic stop practices, one that would extend well beyond Wade's individual case into broader patterns that had gone unexamined for years. Inside the department itself, reactions to the unfolding scandal were far from uniform. Several officers who had worked alongside Wade expressed genuine shock, describing him privately as someone whose temper had always concerned them, but whose conduct had never before crossed so clearly into deliberate harm. Others admitted more quietly that they had suspected for some time that his aggression toward certain drivers followed patterns they had chosen not to question closely enough. The department's leadership, facing intense public scrutiny, distanced itself from him almost immediately, releasing a statement that condemned his actions in the strongest possible terms and promised full cooperation with every stage of the investigation. Through all of it, Simone remained remarkably measured in her public response. When reporters eventually reached her for comment, she gave no lengthy statement, no dramatic condemnation, nothing that resembled a demand for personal vengeance against the man who had rammed her vehicle without cause. She said only that no one, regardless of the badge they wore or the authority they believed it granted them, stood above the law, and that she trusted the investigation to proceed exactly as it should, guided by evidence rather than emotion. It was a simple statement delivered without anger, and it carried far more weight for its restraint than any furious denouncement could have managed. The city council convened an emergency session soon after the footage became public, inviting testimony from civil rights advocates, department leadership, and independent legal experts to examine not only the specifics of Wade's conduct, but the broader patterns that had allowed an officer with a documented history of complaints to remain on active patrol duty without meaningful review. Records surfaced during the hearing showing that Wade had accumulated 11 prior citizen complaints over the course of his career, each one alleging some version of the same aggressive, unprovoked behavior, none of which had ever resulted in serious disciplinary action. The revelation intensified public scrutiny considerably, transforming the conversation from a single reckless act into a broader reckoning with institutional failure. Community organizers who had followed similar cases for years pointed to the incident as a rare example of swift, decisive accountability. They contrasted it pointedly with countless other cases in which officers accused of similar conduct faced little more than a temporary desk assignment. They were careful, however, to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth beneath that swift response. Accountability had moved so quickly largely because of Simone's federal status, not because the department's ordinary oversight system had worked as it should. It was a distinction Simone herself raised in one of her only extended public comments, noting quietly that justice should never depend on who a victim happens to be, and that the response she received was owed in principle to every person who found themselves in a similar position, regardless of their title or clearance level. As the investigation continued, it moved steadily toward a conclusion. Prosecutors reviewing the accumulated footage found the case against Wade essentially undeniable. The traffic camera, the dashboard recording, and the collection of bystander footage all aligned without contradiction. He was formally charged with reckless endangerment and destruction of federal property, charges that carried the very real possibility of significant prison time given the deliberate nature of his actions and the protected status of the vehicle he had struck. His attorney attempted early on to argue that he had acted out of a momentary lapse in judgment, but the consistency of the evidence made that argument increasingly difficult to sustain as the proceedings continued. He was formally terminated from the police department not long after the incident. The decision was announced publicly alongside the department's broader commitment to reforming how traffic stops were conducted across the city. For Wade, the consequences extended far beyond the loss of his position. The career around which he had built his entire identity was gone, replaced by pending criminal charges and a public record that would follow him indefinitely. All because of a reckless decision made when he believed, with total and misplaced confidence, that no one would ever hold him accountable. Commander Beckett requested a private meeting with Simone after the department's formal actions were finalized. He arrived without any of the tactical presence that had surrounded their first meeting on the street and apologized to her directly on behalf of every officer who had allowed a pattern of unchecked aggression to continue unexamined for as long as it had. Acknowledging that the failure went beyond any single individual, Simone listened to him without interrupting, and when he finished, she offered a response that carried none of the bitterness he might reasonably have expected from her. Trust, she told him, is never built through apology alone. It is built through the actions that follow it. Through consistent accountability, through the willingness of institutions to examine their own failures honestly rather than defensively. Beckett nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what she had said, and told her that the department intended to use the case as the foundation for genuine reform in how officers were trained and supervised going forward. She did not promise to believe that the change would hold. She simply told him that she hoped sincerely that it would. She returned to the same SUV after it had been repaired. The physical damage had been erased, but its history remained impossible to forget for anyone who had witnessed what happened. She settled behind the wheel, adjusted her mirror out of habit, and pulled away from the curb exactly the way she always did, without escort, without spectacle, without any outward sign that she was anything other than a woman heading home after a long day. The street around her had long since returned to its ordinary rhythm. Pedestrians walked past without a second glance. Traffic moved in its familiar patterns. No trace remained of the 11 armored vehicles that had once filled the intersection. When Wade's trial finally began, it drew a modest but attentive crowd. Reporters filled several rows, while a handful of former colleagues sat quietly near the back, watching a man they had once trusted with their safety face the consequences of a reckless decision. He did not testify in his own defense. His attorney's final arguments leaned heavily on the absence of any prior violent intent, a strategy that gained little traction against a jury that had already watched the footage dozens of times over the course of the proceedings. When the verdict, guilty on both counts, was read, Wade showed no visible reaction at all, simply lowering his head as the weight of the outcome settled fully over him for the first time. Simone did not attend the trial. She had made a quiet decision early on that her presence there would serve no purpose beyond spectacle, and spectacle had never been something she sought in any part of her life. She continued her work exactly as she had before, reviewing threat assessments, briefing engineers, driving herself home after work through streets that no longer held any particular weight for her beyond the ordinary. If she thought often about what had happened, she never said so publicly. Those who knew her best understood that this, too, was simply who she was, a woman who carried enormous weight without ever needing to display it. What lingered long after the vehicles had dispersed and the cameras had stopped rolling was not the memory of overwhelming force, but the quieter truth underneath it. Power, real power, was never measured by how much fear a person could produce in others. It was measured by restraint, by the discipline to wield authority only in service of what was right, by the willingness to let evidence and process determine outcomes rather than instinct or prejudice. No one deserved to be judged by the color of their skin, the vehicle they drove, or the assumptions strangers made about them in a passing glance. And when authority was abused in defiance of that principle, accountability had to follow, built not on outrage alone, but on documentation, on procedure, on the steady and unglamorous work of doing things correctly. That, in the end, was the only kind of justice that ever truly lasted.